The story begins with a door that should never have opened itself. In a churchyard on the island of Barbados, a stone vault was sealed with a slab of blue Devonshire marble, so heavy it took several men and levers to shift it. Inside, lead coffins lay in silent rows. Outside, the governor of the colony ordered his personal seal pressed into wet cement around the edges of the stone. According to witnesses, no one touched the vault for months. When it was opened again, the seal was intact. The slab was undisturbed, and the coffins inside were in chaos. Tonight, we open the file on the moving coffins of the Chase Vault. The Chase family vault stands in the cemetery of Christ Church Parish, on the south coast of Barbados. In the early 19th century, it was a status symbol, a low, solid structure partly buried in the ground, with a narrow stairway leading down to a small stone chamber. In the Caribbean heat, it was meant to be permanent, dry, secure, immune to the tropical weather and to grave robbers. The first interment there was not a chase at all. In 1807, a woman named Thomasina Goddard was laid to rest in a simple wooden coffin. Her casket was set against the wall. The entrance was sealed with stone and mortar, and nothing unusual was reported. The vault passed to the Chase family, prosperous planters whose reputation on the island was much darker. Thomas Chase, the family patriarch, was known for cruelty toward enslaved people, and, according to some local accounts, toward his own household. Gossip on Barbados in that era carried its own weight. His name came to stand for harsh discipline and simmering resentment. In 1808, the vault was reopened for the burial of a Chase infant. Laborers hauled the blue marble slab aside, descended the short flight of steps, and placed the tiny lead coffin beside Mrs. Goddard's undisturbed casket. The chamber was resealed. No one noted anything strange. 4 years later, in 1812, the vault opened twice in quick succession. First came Dorcas Chase, Thomas's young daughter, dead by her own hand. Contemporary accounts describe her as desperate and unhappy, living under a father whose temper was infamous. She was buried in a heavy lead coffin. Once again, the slab went back into place. A few weeks later, Thomas Chase himself died. His coffin, massive and lined with lead, reportedly required 4 strong men to move it. On a hot August day in 1812, laborers chipped away the cement, levered the slab to one side, and made their way down to clear room for the newest interment. This is where the record shifts from ordinary burial ledger to something stranger. As mourners looked into the vault, they were said to cry out. The smaller coffins had been hurled around the chamber. Dorcas's coffin leaned against a corner. The infant's coffin had been flung to the far side. Only Mrs. Goddard's wooden casket still lay neat and untouched against the wall. There was no sign of flooding, no marks on the sandy floor, no traces of forced entry on the door or the stonework. The coffins were dragged back into ordered rows. Thomas's heavy casket was placed alongside them. The great slab was lowered and cemented again. If this had been the end of the story, we might file it under local rumor, a single unexplained disturbance, mutable with retelling. But the vault did not stay quiet. In the years that followed, the Chase family suffered more losses. Barbados, like much of the Caribbean, was a colony built on enslaved labor. Tension simmered constantly between planters and the people they held in bondage. In April 1816, that tension erupted in a major uprising now known as Busa's Rebellion. Among those killed in the aftermath was a planter named Samuel Brewster Sr. Because of the unrest and the danger of travel, his infant son, Samuel Brewster Ames, had already been interred temporarily at another church. By the time peace returned, the family wanted to move the child to the more prestigious Chase Vault. On the 25th of September 1816, Laborers once again chipped away the cement and heaved the blue marble slab aside. Word of the earlier disturbance had spread, and a crowd of onlookers gathered to see if anything would happen this time. According to later summaries of the event, the scene that greeted them was pure disorder. The lead coffins lay scattered, as if thrown by a giant hand. Thomas Chase's massive casket was tilted upright, its head down in a corner. Dorcas's coffin had slid across the floor. Even the infant's coffin, tiny but solid, had been displaced. Only Mrs. Goddard's wooden coffin remained exactly where it had rested since 1807. Once again the floor bore no drag marks. The walls and ceiling showed no cracks, no staining from floodwater, no signs of entry. The coffins were heavy enough that moving them through the narrow passage would have been noisy and laborious. Yet no one in the neighboring houses reported hearing anything between burials. The coffins were rearranged with some difficulty. The child's lead casket was brought in and added to the lineup. The slab went back, fresh cement sealing the edges. The story might still have faded into local folklore, an island tale, retold at night, and dismissed in daylight if not for what happened next, and for who came to witness it. By 1819, the Chase vault had acquired a quiet notoriety. Reports of the creeping coffins had reached the highest official on the island, the governor of Barbados, Lord Combermere. Combermere was, by most accounts, not a man inclined to superstition. He had served as a cavalry commander in the Napoleonic Wars, faced French artillery, and come away with a reputation for discipline and resolve. The idea that coffins might move of their own accord inside a sealed vault irritated him less as a ghost story than as a potential challenge to order. That July, when a relative of the Chase family, Thomasina Clark, died, the governor decided to attend the opening in person. He brought several aides and instructed masons to treat the vault as if it were an evidence locker. Before the slab was touched, fresh cement was spread around its edges. Combermere and several prominent citizens pressed their signet rings into the wet surface, creating distinctive seals. Fine sand was sprinkled on the floor of the passage. The logic was straightforward. Any intruder would have to disturb the seals or leave footprints and drag marks in the sand. Only then did laborers lever the stone aside. Once again the coffins had moved. The heavy lead caskets lay in confusion, some tilted, some crosswise. Thomas Chase's coffin, which had already defied expectations by moving in 1816, now rested in another position entirely. The infant's coffin had shifted again. Dorcas's coffin leaned at an unnatural angle. Mrs. Goddard's wooden coffin, decayed but still intact, had not moved. The sand on the passage floor remained smooth. The cement seals were unbroken. Under Combermere's direct orders, the coffins were rearranged yet again, with particular care taken to note their positions. The vault was sealed a final time, with fresh cement, new seals, and perhaps a degree of official unease. 9 months later, in April 1820, the governor and his retinue returned for one last inspection. By then, the story of the moving coffins had spread across the island and beyond. This opening was treated almost as a public test. Once again, the seals were inspected. Once again, they were reported intact. Once again, sand was examined and found undisturbed. And once again, when the stone was shifted, the coffins inside the small chamber were in complete disarray. At this point, even Combermere admitted defeat. The coffins were removed from the vault and buried separately in individual graves in the churchyard. Mrs. Goddard's coffin, faithful, immobile, and by then disintegrating, was also taken out. The vault itself was left empty and unsealed, an open stone mouth staring toward the sea. It has remained that way by most accounts ever since. So what happened in that cramped, airless chamber beneath the Barbados sun? We have several layers of testimony, and each raises as many questions as it answers. The most frequently cited account comes from the Honorable Nathan Lucas, a local planter and politician whose grandson would later become the novelist Charles Kingsley. Lucas accompanied Combermere to at least one opening of the vault, and later wrote a detailed narrative of what he saw. He describes the intact seals, the undisturbed sand, the chaotic interior, and his own bafflement. He offers no supernatural explanation. He simply insists that whatever he witnessed was real and not the product of trickery on the day. Lucas's description is echoed, often with embellishment, in later 19th century retellings. Clergymen, travel writers, and collectors of curiosities repeated the story in sermons and magazines. Over time, each repetition added emphasis or moral shading. The cruel slave owner disturbed in death, the rebellious daughter who starved herself, the idea that their emotional turmoil lingered as a restless force inside the stone walls. It's important to note, though, that almost all later versions trace back to a small handful of early witnesses. We are not dealing with dozens of independent contemporaneous records. We're dealing with one or two core narratives, copied and colored over decades. If we stay strictly with what those early accounts say, several natural explanations have been proposed. The simplest is human interference. Could someone, resentful laborers, enemies of the Chase family, participants in the 1816 slave rebellion, have slipped into the vault and hurled the hated planter's coffin around in secret? Given the brutality of plantation life, the motive would not be hard to imagine. But this hypothesis has structural problems. The marble slab reportedly required levers and several strong men to move. Any such operation would have taken time, made noise, and left marks on sand or cement. Combermere's precautions were specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of intrusion. If we accept Lucas's account at face value, there were no footprints, no drag marks, and no broken seals. Skeptics counter that we are relying on witnesses who may have been careless, self-important, or simply too ready to declare themselves baffled. A determined group with inside help could, in principle, have tampered with the vault between inspections and covered their tracks. But there is no documentation of anyone boasting about such a feat later, and no confession in the historical record. Another suggestion centers on geology. Localized earth tremors, it's argued, might have shifted the heavy coffins against each other. If the metal linings were slightly warped, a series of small shocks could, over months, jostle them into new positions. Barbados is not as seismically quiet as it might appear. The island sits near a complex zone of tectonic interaction. Yet when investigators looked for signs of such movement, they found no cracks in the surrounding masonry, and no reports of tremors disturbing neighboring tombs. The motion described in the vault, caskets flung upright, turned completely around, also seems hard to reconcile with gentle shaking that somehow acts only on lead and not on wood. Floodwater has also been invoked. In a hurricane-prone climate, couldn't the chamber have filled and emptied, boring the coffins and setting them down randomly as the waters receded? The problem is residue. Floods leave silt lines, staining warped wood. Contemporary descriptions stress the absence of watermarks on the walls or pooling on the floor, and no other crypts in the same churchyard are recorded as having been inundated in that period. One of the more eccentric lines of inquiry, the idea that fungi or gas pressure might literally lift coffins from beneath, a sort of macabre, magic mushroom effect. Modern experiments with puffball fungi and disintegration patterns have not supported this in any convincing way. Lead coffins weighing hundreds of kilos are not easily levitated by organic growth. So if the mundane mechanisms struggle, what about the paranormal ones? Later writers, especially in the 20th century, began to frame the Chase Vault as a textbook poltergeist case. They pointed to the emotional states of the dead: a tyrannical father, a daughter driven to suicide, children dying in times of riot and fear. Researchers in psychical studies have sometimes suggested that intense, unresolved emotion might manifest as chaotic physical disturbances, doors slamming, objects flung, a surplus energy effect unleashed after a violent or despairing death. Comparisons have been made between the Barbados Vault and famous poltergeist cases in Amherst and Enfield. And those disturbances seem to cluster around individuals rather than locations. In Barbados, the activity appears to be bound to a specific chamber and a specific set of remains. The lead coffins in this reading became containers not just for bodies, but for something else, accumulated anguish that rolled them about like toys. It's a striking image. It's also one that relies heavily on assumption. We have no way to measure emotional energy, no apparatus to distinguish a ghostly shove from a very human one. As with most poltergeist narratives, the chain of evidence runs from eyewitness report to retelling, with no physical trace left behind once the event is over. There is one more possibility, less dramatic but in some ways more unsettling. It is that the story, while based on a kernel of truth, has been transformed by decades of colonial rumor, Masonic gossip, and Victorian appetite for the uncanny. Some researchers have suggested that the Chase Vault affair may have been exaggerated by fraternal groups on the island, spun into a cautionary example of pride, cruelty, and divine retribution. In this reading, there were disordered coffins, perhaps from miscommunication during burials or minor subsidence, but the perfect seals, the untouched sand, and the repeated chaos were embroidered later for moral and narrative effect. If this is correct, then the real mystery is not what moved the coffins, but how a story about them moved through culture. Why this vault? Why this family? Why did a tale set in a small Caribbean churchyard end up in British magazines, psychical research files, and modern paranormal anthologies? Two readings remain plausible. Either something entirely ordinary, structural, shifting secret, tampering, perhaps minor seismic effects amplified by a confined space, fooled a governor, a planter, and everyone else who peered into that stone chamber and then hid its traces with uncanny efficiency. Or the disturbance itself was relatively modest, and what truly moved over the following decades was human imagination, layering moral judgment and supernatural flourish onto an episode that began as nothing more than poor engineering and bad luck. Between those options sits the empty Chase Vault, its stone throat open to the sky, visited by tourists and investigators who stared down into the darkness and try to picture the heavy lead forms tumbling in the silence. We can catalog the testimonies. We can test the soil and reconstruct the weather. We can model forces on lead and calculate whether tremors or floods could account for the chaos described. What we can't do is roll time back and watch the moment when the coffin supposedly leapt. The file for now stays open, a reminder that even in places built to keep the dead still, the stories around them refuse to rest, because every mystery hides a truth.